Hi everyone, welcome back to our chapter 4 mini lecture. As I kind of mentioned to some of you, so like I mentioned to some people, I'm going to be reviewing the quizzes before I make these because I noticed they may have switched out the test bank, and so the questions are a little bit harder, and I want to make sure that you guys are able to perform well on the quizzes. You do still have to read the book because that is part of the course requirements, but I will be doing my best to make the information a bit more digestible, and so that way it's easier to find within the textbook, if that makes any sense. So getting into it, we're going to go over nonverbal communication. Why do we even study nonverbal communication? The nature of nonverbal communication, the functions of nonverbal communication, and the codes of nonverbal communication. And so this can seem a bit redundant because I said nonverbal communication 5 million times, but nonverbal is a huge area of research, and so there's kind of a few main concepts that we'll have to go over when discussing nonverbal communication. And as we've done in the previous lectures, the second principle is about being aware, or the first principle is about being aware. The second one is verbal messages, and the third one is nonverbal messages. Sorry, I can't math. That's why I got a communication studies degree. So if that doesn't say anything about me, but, and after that we'll do listening, and then we'll do adaptation. So getting into nonverbal. So basically, nonverbal communication is any other communication that is not verbal or spoken language. So this can be anything from a peace sign, it can be a hug, it can be how you dress, and we'll get more into detail with what it can be and examples of that as well. So why do we focus on nonverbal communication? So it communicates feelings and attitudes. Through nonverbal communication, we learn how to express ourselves in ways that aren't just verbal, which I think is very important. Although verbal communication is important as well, I think having alternate ways of communicating your own feelings and attitudes is pretty important as well. And typically they are more believable than verbal messages, and this is kind of rooted in the idea that, so from a young age we've been socialized to perceive certain things in a certain way. So for example, if your friend looks like they're having a bad day, they're displaying a lot of nonverbal cues that they are sad or something happened. Obviously, you would be able to recognize that they are upset and ask them if they are upset, and they go, "No, I'm fine, I'm okay." You would be more inclined to not believe that message because their verbal cues are not matching with their nonverbal cues. So verbally they're saying they're fine and they're okay, but non-verbally there is this underlying tone. There's this nonverbal communication happening saying that they are not okay. And that kind of goes into the content versus relational. So what we say versus how we say it. And so they're critical to successful relationships. Obviously, communicating verbally is important, but being able to recognize and communicate with those around you non-verbally is an essential part of maintaining relationships. and not just like romantic, but just platonic, familial, any other type of, yes, any other type of relationship can be romantic, doesn't necessarily have to be. So they also serve multiple functions, and these are essentially the ways we can code nonverbal communication. There's substitute, repeat, complement, contradict, regulate, and accent. So we'll get more into the functions later. We're going to go over the nature of nonverbal communication real quick before getting into that. So obviously, as mentioned before, with verbal communication, nonverbal communication is culture bound, and it is also rule bound. So nonverbal communication is going to be different in the US versus somewhere like the Philippines. Just throwing out a crazy example. You know, there's going to be different expectations of, you know, for example, okay, like this could mean okay here, but somewhere else it could be represented as this, or any other type of just difference in how we use and have coded these nonverbal symbols into our culture and our language. So it's ambiguous, so it leaves room for interpretation. Nonverbal communication isn't explicit. It can be at times, but usually it remains pretty open to interpretation and usually can usually communicates a feeling or general type of attitude. Continuous, we don't ever stop non-verbally communicating. One example I always used to hear was when a student is sleeping in class, does that communicate something non-verbally? And a lot of students will go, no, yes, no. But if you think about it in a bit more detail, when you are sleeping in class, you are non-verbally communicating to your teacher that a couple different things, kind of depends on the professor, but typically if someone was sleeping in my class, I would assume that they either are having a really hard time and they're not sleeping well, or that they are just, you know, having trouble trying to like keep everything together. Some instructors would assume that if a student is asleep, they don't care about class and that they don't care to be there. But basically, just because the person who is asleep isn't trying to communicate, there is still an ongoing, continuous communication happening outside of them with their body language. So it is non-linguistic, and this kind of plays into the idea that nonverbal communication doesn't necessarily absolve the need for verbal communication. Otherwise, we wouldn't have languages. But what it means by being non-linguistic, essentially, it's saying that it doesn't need to be attached to language. So, you know, if you've ever, so way back when I used to work at the outlets, and obviously we're in Texas, so like I would understand like if a Spanish person came, someone who spoke Spanish would come and ask where the bathroom was, but the outlets also get a lot of international travel. So they had a lot of people from Asia, they had a lot of people from the Middle East come in, and sometimes they don't know English, they're traveling to shop. So instead, just kids do it too. Instead of being like, I need to go to the bathroom, sometimes you'll do like the bathroom waddle. And so it's not limited by language. Again, this isn't true all the time, but generally you would be able to figure out where the bathroom is or help someone find a bathroom that doesn't exactly know the same language that you do. Multi-channeled just kind of means that it can be used over multiple different avenues. This kind of goes back, if you guys remember our first assignment in our models of communication, they ask what channel it occurs over. And so it can, by multi-channeled, it can be either face-to-face, it can be over the phone, it can be via voice, proxemics, it can travel. You can communicate non-verbally through multiple different avenues, and we'll kind of go more into detail with that. One question I always like to raise, because it makes things more fun and not like we're studying the historical aspects of nonverbal communication, but obviously I can't ask directly, or else that is what I would do. But do you personally think that emojis would be nonverbal communication, in the way that we use those um, change the way that we communicate? So for example, um, the little, I'm going to draw it because I don't know how to describe it. It's so fun and I love it. And ironically, I've been like using this set of emoji for ever, since like 2016, and it's just now becoming popular. So I'm absolutely all for it. But there's there's the little face emoji. Back when I started doing it, I always put like the nose though in the middle instead of the mouth, and I would put the mouth lower. But that emoji kind of communicates a lot of things. And if you think about it and go through the nature list that we have written down here, that emoji set would be culture bound, because I don't think um, other cultures would really understand if you sent that to them. And I think they might be very confused. It's bound by rules in the idea of human anatomy. You know, if you change up the middle to be a star, to replace the mouth with a star emoji, people would be a bit confused because it would have a different meaning going into the rules. It's ambiguous, so it doesn't really have an exact definition. It is continuous in the sense that it is always going to communicate something and it is always existing. Obviously, it's non-linguistic and it's multi-channeled. So I hope all of those little examples kind of helped explain the nature of nonverbal communication. So moving on. Oh, hold on 1 second. I forgot I was cooking mac and cheese. Gonna pause this. Sorry about that. So getting back into it, how does nonverbal function? And we went over this earlier a bit. So essentially, let's get all of them out here. So how does nonverbal function? I would also recommend going into the textbook and looking up the definitions and looking up the examples, because these are a bit complicated, especially since some of them are very similar, especially with ones like complement and accent. They can get a bit confused. So I would recommend focusing on how to distinguish those within the text. I also will go over them briefly here, but just to make sure that you all properly understand it, because there is going to be a question about how to recognize a nonverbal function. So I would, like I said, go into the textbook and make sure that you fully understand that. Right, sorry, I keep like pausing and stuff. I had to cook, and so I can't. Oh, we're getting very purple light today. I apologize for that. I lack a natural lighting source in here. Today's been very personable, I think. I'm sorry if this ends up making the lecture a little bit longer, but after talking to some of you, I heard that you guys would prefer a little bit more of a longer lecture, so it goes more in detail with the information. So I hope this is closer to what you guys want and what you like. You know, we're all kind of adjusting during COVID. I originally was, hoping and planning to teach this in person, but we're kind of just, taking what we have and we're rolling with it. So going back into nonverbal functions, substitute is basically replacing the verbal message. So for example, instead of saying, okay, you would give a thumbs up. Accenting is basically kind of an emphasis. It's very, very similar to compliment, but accent will basically any type of nonverbal cue that will emphasize a certain message. So for example, this could be like a raised eyebrow when you're asking a question, or confused, or like if someone wants you to do something and it's like gross, like I don't know why I'm thinking of like when you're a kid and you like make gross slop out of your leftover like lunch plate, and instead of being like no, you'd be like no, and that base is kind of like accenting to go along with the like instead of sitting there and being like no, you would make like the face instead, if that makes any sense. And like I said, going back to the book, because some of these can get very similar, especially just accent and complement, are the hardest ones to distinguish. Repeating is basically just doing giving a verbal and nonverbal message at the same time. So how for substitute it was a thumbs up, in the sense of repeat it would be like sounds good, and you would be doing both of those. Regulate are kind of those little nonverbal cues that either stop or stop or continue a communication. So for example, if someone is telling you a story, usually you'll be sitting there and you'll be nodding your head, and that is a form of regulating, because you are communicating to them that you're listening and that you're following along, and that you are encouraging them to keep talking, versus if someone was talking to you and you were like this the whole time, staring down at your hands, at your watch, looking away, those would be regulating nonverbals that would mean that you would not want to communicate or continue communication. Compliment, like I said, very similar to accent. This is just anything that is meant to make messages easier when nonverbal and verbal communication complement each other. So basically, they're used to elaborate a bit more on verbal messages to reinforce the information. Basically, if you're telling someone I love you, but you're like, I love you, that wouldn't be very complimentary. You would want your voice, your nonverbal voice tone, and the verbal words to match up with what you're saying. And then contradict is pretty simple. That's basically being the opposite of what the message is sending. So this is just a sample question. I'm going to leave it up here. So what statement illustrates a person using a nonverbal cues to complement a message? Is it a person pointing while giving you directions? Is it a person saying hello followed by a wave? A person saying, I don't have an attitude problem, while stomping his foot on the word attitude? Or a person holding up her hand to interrupt another person? And so kind of going through it, obviously you are kind of left with either A or C, because it would either be while or on the word. So complement would actually end up being A, because they're pointing while giving you directions. So they are nonverbal messages complementing their verbal message to give a clearer and more concise meaning, versus accent would be C, if you can kind of see the differences now. So in accenting, it emphasizes the message, versus complement makes the message clearer. I hope this example question kind of helps distinguish the two. So now moving on to the nonverbal codes and subcodes. So there's appearance, kinesics, eye contact, facial expression, haptics, vocalics, and physical environment. And we'll go into detail about those a bit more too. So what are the nonverbal codes? Breaking it down, appearance can be anything, any type of physical display on a person that will communicate something. This goes into the idea of, the first time you meet someone, they're already making assumptions about you based off of how you look. And while I personally kind of draw issue with this, because I don't think we should necessarily be making assumptions off of physical appearances, that's something I've had to like unlearn and teach myself not to perform in that way. But even then, it is still extremely hard to not make certain assumptions about people. So the images on the screen are of an Olympic player. I can't remember if he was in a scandal for sex or drugs, but I don't remember what the specifics was, but he got basically in a huge scandal, and when he came back and he started to have to face the repercussions, you can see how he changed his appearance from what traditional society would perceive as delinquent, with bleached hair, it's spiked up, blah, 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 blah. Again, I don't think that this necessarily conveys that type of behavior, but this is an example that was given. And so when he started going through the legal process and kind of appealing to the masses and the media, he instead changed his hair, not only the color, but how he styles it. So instead of it being spiked up, it's like a nice little accountant comb over. He's wearing a button collared up shirt. All of this in order to seem more normal and more as a safe person than as a dangerous person during his damage control of his scandal. And so kinesics, this kind of refers to human movement, gestures, postures. The examples they give are of Kaepernick kneeling, and so how even though he's just kneeling, we kind of understand that those gestures and those body poses are representative of they have underlying meanings of Black empowerment in a white society. So for example, you can kind of see how they're kneeling, so they're protesting the NFL and its injustices towards Black and brown bodies. Same thing here, they're kind of holding up their fists in a Black Lives Matter esque moment. And so even though they're not saying that, we as a culture, going back to how it's culture bound, we as a culture would be able to assume not even assume, we would be able to come to that conclusion because of their body language. Awesome. And so eye contact, that one is pretty simple. Most of us understand how eye contact works. Same thing with facial expressions. Haptics refers to touch. So for some people, they prefer and engage in, I'm going to change my light real quick because I feel like it's very distracting for you guys. Okay, cool. So haptics kind of refer to touch, and basically people who communicate. If you've ever heard of people who have different love languages, touch is one of the 5 love languages, and so the way people use physical intimacy and touch can be a way to communicate closeness or to communicate that they don't want to be close. Moving on, vocalics refers to the vocal aspects of communication, and this can be a bit tricky because you might think vocalics synonymous with words and verbal language, but instead this is more so the tone, the rate, more so how you say things versus what you're saying. So going into showing some fun stuff about nonverbal comm, they actually did a study and show that married couples do end up looking like each other, and I would end up even arguing that you could draw the same conclusions about, family members or anyone who has lived together for an extended number of years. But eventually, the sentiment of monkey see, monkey do, we as humans end up copying the facial expressions made at us. And so in copying those facial patterns, we end up looking like those people who we choose to have around us in our lives through super weird metaphor, but if you think about crumpling a paper and then uncrumpling it and then crumpling another paper in the same way, you end up looking the same because of the trauma that your face makes, the repeated physical trauma, leaving wrinkles and other other marks on the face. So, you can probably tell, like, people who laugh a lot when they get older in life will have a lot of crow's feet and will have smile lines, versus people who scowl a lot will have different wrinkles in different areas. So moving on to physical environment, proxemics, and territoriality. And these all are kind of like interplayed. The physical environment just refers to the space around you. Proxemics refers to this little graph image on the PowerPoint slide. So there's this kind of general expectation of who we let into our space, essentially. So, if you have no idea who someone is, like have never met them before, and you're on the street and they come up to you and they are, 1 to 4 feet away, you're going to be pretty uncomfortable and not want to talk to them, and your nonverbal communication will probably reflect that. Territoriality. So that kind of refers into the dominance and owning of spaces. So for example, again, in person, this would make a bit more sense, but I don't know if you guys have ever heard of the unassigned assigned seat. There's this expectation. This once in class, you have taken that first week of classes, and everyone has kind of found their spot. There is that unsaid rule of territoriality. So if someone takes your spot, they are kind of breaking that norm of your space. And there's other ways that you can even, define your space. But another aspect to talk about is expectancy violation theory. And this kind of goes into the idea that when someone breaks the expectations of these norms, so say you go up to someone and you tell a joke and instead they start laughing, or someone takes your spot, you're unassigned assigned seat. There is going to be this violation of the expectations. So when that happens, there will usually be a conflict of some sort, but basically expectancy violation theory just says that if someone violates your expectations, usually there will be some form of conflict, revolution, or unsettling feelings. So now I hope that you guys have a better understanding on nonverbal communication and all the different components of it today. If you have any questions about this topic, obviously you're all free to email me. Let me know if this helped more than the lectures before. That'll kind of let me know if you guys enjoy the longer lectures, and you don't have to necessarily email me for this. You guys could even comment on the YouTube page, just so I kind of have a better understanding of where I should be taking these mini lectures. And again, my bathroom demon and I say farewell. You'll have a nice day.